what we initially pitched with the book and what it ended up being is a little bit different. It's not totally different, but it's a little bit different. We need a bad guy, right?
The challenge we had too, other stories, but in particular about women at war, it was usually just covering one deployment. Shannon was killed on her 5th combat deployment. Her saga really started with 9/11, and she was killed fighting ISIS in Syria at the culmination of when we defeated the caliphate just a couple months before we killed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So we had the challenge of trying to cram a huge career into a book. We didn't have the luxury to go blow by blow, month by month, target by target. We had to give the reader a perspective of like, hey, this has been a really long war. What ultimately ended up culminating with her death, this was a very, very long conflict that was fought over a long period of time repeatedly by the same cast of characters.
Is that much of it? That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Kerry Kite. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post-9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills. Episode 92 features Marty Skovlund Jr. and Joe Kent, the co-authors of a book about Joe's wife, legendary operator Shannon Kent, called Send Me, the true story of a mother at war. Shannon hunted high-value targets on classified missions in the most dangerous locales on Earth while trying to balance her life as a wife and a mother. She was killed in action fighting ISIS in Syria. Welcome. This is Veteran Made. This episode is brought to you by Go Pills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time.
All right, we are live. We have waited the appropriate amount of time here on Riverside. Good just afternoon for Marty and myself, and good morning to you, Joe Kent and Marty Skovlund Jr. Welcome to Veteran Made.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Very excited to have this conversation and excited to talk about this story and to talk a little bit about the process that the two of you went through to put the story together, write the story, and get it published. So for those very few in the audience who don't know who each of you are, if you could give just a brief primer on yourselves and your background, and then we'll jump into some questions here.
Go for it, Joe.
So Joe Kent spent a little over 20 years in the Army as a Green Beret. Did some time in a special operations unit, which is where I met Shannon. I was in the CIA for a little bit after that. But most importantly, for the sake of this story, I was married to Shannon Kent, who was killed in 2019 fighting ISIS in Syria.
Yeah, I was in the Army as well for about 8 years, not as long as Joe. Served most of that time in the Ranger Regiment, and then after I left the service, made my way into the field of journalism, wrote a previous book on the Ranger Regiment, got into conflict reporting. I've gone back to Afghanistan, back to Iraq as a reporter, and then also a brief stint in Ukraine right after the invasion there. Ended up being connected with Joe through a mutual friend, and wrote an initial article on Shannon, and from there we went into writing a full book together.
Yeah, I'd love to start there at the genesis of your two's relationship here, and that feature for Coffee or Die, Marty, that you're referring to. And I think even like back when you had first published that article, that feature, you and I were talking, and you were like, there's something more kind of brewing here, and that's obviously been a few years in the making. So how did you two first meet? Where did you meet? And what was that initial conversation about collaboration like between the two of you? Was there did sparks fly? Were you excited about it, or was there some hesitation there?
So my first introduction to Joe was through my boss at the time, Evan Hafer. He's the founder of Black Rifle Coffee, and it was, I don't know, a week, maybe 2 weeks after the attack in Manbij, Syria, that killed Shannon and three other Americans and more over almost, I think, 18 Syrians. Huge suicide bomber attack, and so of course that made the news. I was aware that it happened, and Evan was like, "Hey, I don't know if you saw that attack, but the Joe is." Works in the same field. I'd love for you to link up with him and figure out a story to do on Shannon. And for me, right off the bat, because I remember reading the initial news reports, and this is where I think Joe and I's thought process, at least initially, crossed streams. I remember reading the initial news reports and them kind of characterizing Shannon and this group of people that were out as like they were out to lunch and stuff. And you looked at like just the bios, a naval cryptologist, a former Navy SEAL, a Syrian American, like it just, and then a special forces warrant officer. My initial thing right off the bat was just like, I don't think that this is, there's some sort of story being told here because they don't want to talk about what they were actually doing. That was my first take on it. And so Evan linked Joe and I up. We initially talked, and I kind of was like, hey, I would love to come down from the memorial that they were doing at Annapolis. My entire thing in journalism is always trying to, whenever I can, be sort of boots on the ground, right? You can always tell a better story that way. And so I came down for the memorial, initially met Joe and Ali, which is a family friend of theirs, and also served with Shannon. And we initially talked there, and I was very cognizant, of course, at the time of like, hey, I'm walking into the home of somebody that just lost his wife, the mother of his children, and all these things. Like, I was definitely ready for it to be a really sort of sensitive, difficult interview. And, Joe right off the bat was just very mission focused on, I need to tell my wife's story. And he had kind of explained to me like, yeah, it wasn't the going out to lunch crowd. And I think that was, Joe can talk more about that, but I think that was initially what kind of like pissed him off a little bit, as far as her service and that group's service being characterized that way. And yeah, I came down to like I said, went to the memorial, where, it took me, I think, a couple of months to put that feature together, published that in May 2019. And then it was shortly after that, we were kind of off to the races, putting a book proposal together.
Joe, did you know that Evan had connected with Marty and wanted to get a story going that quickly?
No, actually, I asked Evan if he could help because I was familiar with Coffee or Die. I was familiar with Marty. I think he had just recently gotten back from doing it in bed with the Special Forces team in Afghanistan. And so I, like Marty talked about, right after Shannon was killed with three other Americans, the initial party line was like, these guys were just killed out getting kebabs or something like that. And I didn't really, I don't know if I ever planned on really talking to the media. Had they just said, hey, these guys were killed fighting ISIS, had they just left it at that, I think, I don't know. I may not have ever even felt compelled to tell her story. But I kind of got pissed that they were trying to spin this narrative that was clearly false. And sometimes, it's necessary in the intelligence community, in special operations, to spin a narrative. But like, this just wasn't the case, in my opinion. And, I had access to kind of all the classified information that went into the mission, and I knew there was a way that they could properly tell this story. So it pissed me off that they weren't doing that initially. And so I had some real initial contacts with reporters that otherwise, like I said, I probably would have just blown them off. But the New York Times, Washington Post, they were really interested. A couple of national security reporters, they also, their spidey senses went up and they knew that it wasn't right. One of them, ironically enough, was embedded with my team, my SF team, in 2004. We went into Fallujah. And so I reached out through another friend to him, but I still just didn't have a comfortable feeling talking to a lot of these national security reporters. No ding on them. They actually did really good stories on Shannon in the New York Times and then eventually in the Washington Post. But I personally didn't feel comfortable with them. I had another mutual friend who served with Evan, and he said, hey, Evan wants to help in any way, shape, or form. Black Rifle Coffee, and Evan knows he's in a position where he can help. What can he do? And so I had a conversation with Evan, and I was like, man, I feel like I'm really well taken care of, but if you can help me tell Shannon's story, that'd be amazing. And then the rest is kind of history. Marty came out, and I think Marty and I clicked right away. I grew up in Ranger Battalion. He grew up in Ranger Battalion. I was familiar with Marty's work. My concern with a lot of the national security beat reporters was that they were always going to be looking for some sort of a scoop, some sort of insight, tell-all into special operations, intel, something like that, as opposed to just telling Shannon's story. And there was enough that Marty had already done where I was like, okay, this guy's from our community. He's one of us. I feel comfortable with him. He's got a body of work that says he's dedicated to telling the stories of warfighters without trying to do some kind of a tell-all. And so really from there, that was that. The rest, really from there, the rest is history.
Yeah, it comes through in the book because there are deep insights in the book about the community and how the community operates and how Shannon operated within the community, how you operated within the community. And it feels like much deeper insights than you otherwise would have gotten, than we as the audience and consumers would have gotten, like you're saying, from a beat reporter. And again, no ding on them either, because they have an important role to play, as journalists in this country. But I think, in the spirit of veteran made and telling these stories from within the community, kind of for the community, it shines through in the book. It's also interesting because you and Shannon, and you talk about it in the book, like you two were able, because you were married and had access to all these networks, you were able to communicate in ways that other folks that were married wouldn't have been able to communicate about these things. So the access that you had, obviously certainly helped to tell the story. I want to talk a little bit about how you framed the story. My favorite thing about the book is that the scenes that read like a thriller, like a novel, like a story, really feel like that, and I'm in it. And then when you switch over to more of kind of that standard nonfiction style that is giving us information that we need to have context, both for, Joe, you and Shannon and your family, as well as what the country was doing, what was happening in a lot of those environments. What were the initial discussions between the two of you on that framework for the book in order to tell kind of not both sides of the story, but tell the story in both of those ways so that the reader could move through the book without losing any pace?
Yeah, I really think that what we initially pitched with the book and what it ended up being is a little bit different. It's not totally different, but it's a little bit different in that we kind of decided, after we'd already partnered up with William Morrow on the book, that, hey, we need to have some sort of antagonist here. Otherwise, if we just chronicle Shannon's story all throughout, it's going to read a little bit like a straight biography or Wikipedia entry. We need a bad guy, right? And as anybody that's spent any amount of time in the military knows, you're not ever just going after, it's not Batman and the Penguin, right? Like it's not, it's never that. You're going after a multitude of different boogeymen, and depending on which countries, Shannon deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. There's multiple boogeymen she's going after. Who she was kind of, the main target that everybody was in pursuit of at the time of her death was ISIS, was al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. So we kind of said, why don't we just use him and his rise to power? And I knew enough about his background. I knew he'd gotten picked up back in 2004. I was like, okay, that's around the same time that Shannon kind of enters the scene. We could probably parallel those things, and that would work okay, I think. And so we went with that. And and we'd also, as far as format goes, we also originally were going to have all of Joe was going to have what we called these memoir chapters, where they were first person for Joe and telling that story. And as we got through it, because it ended up being like 4 different points of view throughout the book, it kind of became confusing for the reader, I think. So we said, why don't we just put everything in third person past tense? And then all of a sudden it felt like everything started to like really come together. But yeah, Joe, that was kind of my point of view on that.
Yeah, I think a challenge we had too, other stories that I think I've gotten told about the military, but in particular about women at war, it was usually just covering one deployment. It wasn't spanning a vast swath of time. I mean, Shannon was killed on her 5th combat deployment. I mean, her saga really started with 9/11. And so we needed to find a way to actually to tell that tale. And she, spent a lot of her time fighting against ISIS, fighting against other terrorists, But at the end of the day, I mean, she was killed fighting ISIS in Syria at kind of the culmination of when we defeated the caliphate just a couple months before we killed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And so, we had the challenge of trying to cram a huge career into a book because we didn't have the luxury of being able to go blow by blow, month by month, target by target. We had to put a lot into a small space, but then also really to give the reader a perspective of like, hey, this has been a really long war. What ultimately ended up culminating with her death, and then we get into the later chapters on how our life shaped up as Baghdadi's finally killed. This started years and years ago. And so I think that that's really important to remind people that this was a very, very long conflict that was fought over a long period of time repeatedly by kind of the same cast of characters.
Yeah, I mean, and the other villain that shows up in the book that I'm ashamed to say kind of took me by surprise was the mental health crisis that the community is experiencing. That scene with James in the hospital was just, I mean, had me in tears. It was brutal. Because you had an idea you have an idea as a reader. I'm not spoiling anything. You have an idea of how that scene is going to play out as you're reading it, because those of us that are a part of the veteran community, the military community, and then others that are a part of the SOF community specifically, we've either had these conversations, we've been privy to these conversations, or we've talked about this topic, and that chapter unfolds, and it was brutal, but it was also just beautiful and kind of showed that layered approach that Shannon took to everything that she did, and how her professional calling permeated her entire life. It wasn't just collecting information from humans to go hunt bad guys. It was also to understand her friends, understand her colleagues, understand her family. How did that part of the story, as she was fighting to become an officer and as she was fighting to start another fight that she ultimately obviously did not have the opportunity to continue, how did that take shape as a part of the writing process between the two of you?
Right off the bat, we knew that, I mean, even from writing the article, that her process to become, to get into the doctorate program and pursue that was a big part of the story. Because at the end of the day, had she been allowed into that program, she would not have been in Syria. She would not have been killed. And so in my mind, I wanted to, one of my goals with this book was, I want readers to feel even just like 1/1000th of the loss that Joe and his family have had to feel. And for that to happen, I think that, kind of everybody knows how the book is going to end, right? Like, not literally, but like they know Shannon dies, right? Like they know they're reading a book about somebody that is no longer with us. I wanted, as the book came through, there to be these like off ramps that we just blew by on the interstate of the story, right? We're just blowing by these off ramps that the reader in their head is like, no, take that. Like, no, like pursue, so I want them to be shouting at the pages. And so her not getting into that doctorate program, that's like one of the biggest ones. That's one of the biggest opportunities. And there's some other ones that we built in there, conversations with friends and conversations her and Joe had, because I think Shannon always knew she was going to do this, but she definitely, from my perspective, was very introspective and trying to like basically interrogate herself on is this the right thing to do for my family? Joe's got obviously much more insight into that, though.
Yeah, I mean the mental health crisis. It was kind of twofold. I mean, Shannon experienced it through James, and then through one of the SEAL commanders she worked under in Afghanistan, who killed himself on that deployment. That was from the time I met her. She was talking about that. So she was talking about the mental health crisis and veteran suicide before it was really kind of a buzzword in the media, and that's why she pursued psychology. And attempted to get into that program. But then, also like Marty said, it was just such a huge offer. I mean, she got accepted into the program. She wasn't going to go on the deployment. And then the Catch-22 issue with her cancer that she beat, and then saying that she wasn't qualified to, serve as a commissioned officer, but she was qualified to go to combat. That was just a massive blow. That really, she dealt with kind of personally, because she knew that that door had closed, so she had to continue to move on. But that was something that she was really passionate about, and that crisis has only gotten worse, as time has gone on. So it's definitely something that's another angle of the story, I think, that's still pretty relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been really easy to tell just the operator and intelligence collector story, or to kind of make it all about mental health, but you two were able to weave these things in. It very much, as somebody who did not serve in the GWAT in that capacity, I just served on the flight line in the Air Force. It still very much felt like a full picture of what it was like to be a warfighter in the GWAT, like during this period of time. And you two were able to cover off on all of these different aspects of Shannon's story and Joe, of your own story, and making it feel relatable, but also exceptional at the same time. Joe, as Marty mentioned that you initially had some kind of first person memoir style chapters. How did that writing kind of affect and go into this third person approach? And what was that collaboration like with Marty to maybe write some of those and then have them not make it into, or kind of go through that editing process, that collaborative process with the co-writer for you?
Yeah, when we first started writing the book, I mean, I really just Marty said, "Hey, just try and write down as much of from start to finish you and Shannon's life. The high points from the time you guys met, deployments, those types of things, the birth of your children, and then ultimately, the way that things turned out." So, kind of wrote all that, and then later on, we kind of sat down and decided, what the different chapters or portions of the book would be. So yeah, I mean, we really refined my portions where I'm telling our story, especially when it was first person, where it was very clear that it was me speaking. But we had done so much work on that, and I think we had those to such a tight place that by the time we made the decision, us and our editor made the decision to change everything to a third person narrative, I don't think there was really drastic changes. Like I still feel like this is me speaking, even though it's not me, even though it's in one voice, so it's smoother to read for an outsider. But I feel like it's 100% still me telling our story. Like I can tell where the chapter breaks are, where it's Marty doing investigative research, and then boom, the next chapter is me talking about our home life. The transition's just much easier. But yeah, it was quite the process. I learned a lot about writing. It was also very cathartic to kind of write all that down and realize this is what my kids are going to read someday about their mom.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because I'm sure you've obviously written lots of briefs and after actions and all of those kinds of things throughout your career in the military. But had you been like a journaler before this, or writing this kind of story this kind of way? You said it was cathartic, but what was the tactical experience like for you to write in this way?
My experience of writing is kind of funny. I enlisted in the Army when I was 18, went to Ranger Battalion, then SF, and thought I was just going to never have to. This is like when computers were coming online, because I'm a little bit older, and so I thought I was never even going to have to learn how to type. But as I gravitated towards the intel side, I realized I had to type and I had to write a lot. And initially it was just military briefings, very bottom line up front style of writing. But then as I got more deeper into the intel world, we actually you have to write a good deal, and you have to be able to convey your thoughts. You actually have to be able to convey, if you're talking about human intelligence, you do have to be able to convey a lot about human emotion and just those types of things. I don't think you get much experience writing in that style anywhere else in the military. So I definitely learned a lot from Marty and working with our editors on how this looks in a book. But for me, it was a really good experience. It helped me actually finally get a lot of these thoughts and these feelings out, and to know that they would survive beyond just the stories I tell orally.
Marty, what was it like on your end working? Obviously, you've worked with editors quite a bit, and I'm sure as a journalist, you've had contributors, co-contributors to features and articles that you've written, and you and Leo have written together, obviously over the years. But what was the experience like for you writing with Joe, for whom this is very, very personal, and you probably feel a sense of duty to him personally and to Shannon personally. And you obviously open up the book talking about having never met her, but you feel like you know her. And then also being fair to the military, the soft community, America, Iraq, like all these different kind of stakeholders. What was it like for you to compile all of that research and help Joe pull it into a narrative to move the whole story forward?
Well, I'll say, as far as being worried about doing justice by those other entities, I mean, there's a very steep drop off in my priorities after Joe and his family, making sure they're happy with it. Everybody else, there's a very steep drop. The distance between number one priority and 2, 3, 4 it's large, right? So my biggest concern from the get-go was like, I need this to, one, live up to, because I know if Shannon were here writing, like in the same position writing a book, she would like, how would she approach it? And I know it would be like, there's nothing she wouldn't do to get it right, to get the details right, to like her. The one thing that I understand about her very well at this point is her work ethic was incredible. So I wanted to make sure that I was doing it like, to, writing to a level that would be acceptable to Shannon and her standards. And then also, Joe said from the get-go, this is something he wants for his boys to be able to read someday. They were 1 and 3 when Shannon was killed. They never are really going to have the chance to know their mom in that way, so this book will be, among the things that are used for them to be able to know. And so it's kind of like, oh shit, like, no pressure, right? Like, this is something, and I'll admit, like, it's something that I grappled with a lot of, like, there was multiple points where I was like, I am failing Joe, I am failing the family, and all that, because it's a lot to take on about, somebody's life that I can't just talk to her. Most of her life is classified, and most of her friends are still working in a environment where they don't really want to talk to journalists, which is completely understandable. So it definitely was a tall order. I will say that, like, as far as working with Joe, though, he made it extremely easy. I mean, I get that Joe's worked in a joint environment almost his entire life. So I think for him, I don't want to speak for you, Joe, but I'm sure for you, it's like, hey, coming into this, like, I know how to work with people that aren't exactly me. Like, it's not like Joe doesn't know how to be a team player. Like, that's, that's something he was really easy to work with throughout the entire thing. He picked up the writing thing. Like, I thought it was going to be like, I was going to have to do a lot of rewriting and stuff. I really didn't. Joe was really good right off the bat. I think I sent him one book on memoirs right off the bat, thinking, and I don't know if that was any help at all, Joe, but like, as far as like the first things that you were writing, it was like really good right off the bat. So I think one thing as far as process goes that really helped throughout, as far as, because some of the things that Joe wrote would be like, for him, he would write a chapter, right? But like, we would take, okay, a third of it is going to go in this chapter in the book, a third of it is going to go in that chapter, and this third is going to go here. So the things that he wrote didn't necessarily stay together in the way that he wrote them, just depending on where it was. One of the most important things that I think we did is when we first went to New York to go like pitch the book, we got an Airbnb and we spent most of a night going through and writing out the entire chronology of Shannon's life on graph paper. That is something that I referenced throughout the entire thing, because outside of that first chapter where we have kind of a cold start there, after that first chapter we go right back to the beginning of Shannon as a child, and it's pretty much chronological all the way through. It's just the easiest way to sort of put her life together. So having that information of just, here's when all of her deployments landed, here's when the birth of her children happened, married, like all these sort of milestones throughout, and it was very detailed. I think it spanned like 9 or 10 sheets of graph paper. And then I also, so basically there was above the line that was like Shannon's personal lived experience, and then below the line, I'd put these tabs that were like significant moments in the War on Terror, which you would see translate into on here, like, when's the first time Baghdadi was picked up in 2004? When was Zarqawi killed? When did the SOFA get signed in Iraq in 2009, right? Like, all these different points in there that were going to be important, and that helped sort of translate where Shannon's head was at, where Joe and Shannon were at as a relationship, and how those sort of world events were directly impacting their personal life. So that was one of the biggest things right off the bat, I think, that we did that made a huge difference in the book.
Yeah, I mean, the experience from the reader's standpoint there is that, like, that framework just shows you how legendary her work was. And obviously it becomes clear as the book ends, as the book unfolds, rather, I should say. Obviously the ending is particularly difficult and particularly is specific to that time she spent there in that location. But that framework that you're describing is like the framework for her entire adult professional life. And it is actually wild to read that and see it all unfold and realize that this woman had more than just a hand in so much of this. I mean, she was directing much of it, and it's an experience to read. It was wild. In terms of the publishing process, you mentioned pitching it, right? So you wrote a feature. You worked with Joe to kind of get that feature process started and tell that story. initially right after right after her death happened. Um, Marty, to you, and then Joe, I want to ask you the same question, but Marty first, if you don't mind. As time progressed and it got farther away from her death, the story still has an urgency from you, having known you and having seen some of the things that you kind of posted along the way. Like there was a sense of urgency that you felt all the way up until now as you moved to publish. But what did it feel like to write that feature so quickly and then get to work on the larger book? And did you wrestle at all with that urgency, or did you move through it more methodically and slowly to make sure you got it right?
Um, you know, so you say I wrote the feature quickly. I think I was the last of the people that wrote uh, features on Shannon to publish. She was killed in January of 2019. I published that feature in May of 2019. So I think I was kind of the last one there. But it was also the long. I think that was a 5,000 or 6,000 word feature, and had a lot of detail in there. And so that was a couple of months. And that was really, as I was writing that, I was already thinking like, okay, if this were a book, there was so many things that I had to leave out. It was clear that if I had more the real estate of a book, we could tell so much more of her story. Whereas we had to condense a lot of that for the feature. Um, the urgency initially was just to get that feature done, and I interviewed multiple, not as many people as I ended up interviewing for the book, but multiple people for that. Started to be introduced to how difficult it would be to find people that were both knew Shannon and were willing to talk, and all that. So there was a little bit of urgency there. And I still think that when I hit publish, I think, Carrie, you and I have a mutual friend in Adam Linehan, and I think he'd probably have a lot of the same sentiments about his features, where you never really feel good about a feature that you publish. You just kind of figure, it's time to publish this thing. I can't wait any longer. You could tinker with these things for the rest of your life. So I think I just got to a point where I remember I actually published it from DC. I was down there to interview somebody, and I published it from a hotel in DC near where Joe and Shannon lived. And then from there, I think it was, Joe, if I remember correctly, I think it was like that day or like the day after, something like that, where you're like, hey, dude, like, yeah, let's do a book, and then, so if you take it from May, just timeline wise, from May, we decided to do a book. It took all the way up until October of that same year, October 2019, to finish the proposal, which the proposal was beefy. It was like, I think like 20,000 words or something like that. Like it was a beefy proposal. And so that took until about October. And then we went and did the meetings with the publishers in December of 2019. And we met with a few different places, and where we ended up working with, they were the people that most closely aligned with, like, yeah, you and Joe's vision for what this book will be. And like Joe said, not wanting some sort of tell-all, being much more interested in the human aspect of Shannon's story, and not looking for some sort of inside scoop on how special operations units work. Like that was the type of people we wanted to work with, and that's who we ended up going with. And then from there, it was, like I said, December 2019, come back from Christmas, start working on the book. Pandemic starts, can't travel, anything like that, and that kind of created some initial obstacles. And then you just think like, man, this took, okay, so you're telling me, Marty, that this took almost 5 years to write? Well, about like a year and a half of that was waiting for DOD and CIA to come back. CIA was actually really quick. DOD took quite a bit of time. And so, yeah, but I'll say, like, the urgency was always there because we went through multiple drafts. Many of those initial drafts, from my perspective, are garbage. I think Joe, on a lot of them, was like, I don't see the problem. They look good. But for me, it was like, I know I can do better. I know personally I can do better than this and do this story more justice. And there were things all the way right up until this thing was going off to start the production process. I stuck in a couple more paragraphs, like right at the 11th hour there, that I came across a high school friend that I hadn't been introduced to before. And, and it just made the story just that 1% better than it would have been, and so there was, the urgency was there the entire time. And it definitely took a lot longer. I think both Joe and I were thinking this book was going to be published in like 2021 or 2022, something like that, and the fact that we are now in 2024 is just like, We just got the hardcovers in yesterday, and just looking at them, like, man, 5 years into this, like 5 years since Shannon was killed, over 5 years since she was killed, 5 years almost to the day since the initial feature was published. Like, this is, I don't think that, the urgency was there the entire time, Carrie, and I don't think that we could have, in 5 years, we could have done any better than we did with this book. I think this book is as good as it possibly could have been with what we had to work with in the time we had to work with. 25, 50 years from now, when things are declassified, will there be a more complete story that may be able to be written? Sure. This is the most complete story about Shannon Kent that I think could possibly have been done in that time frame.
I would imagine that's a great place to be. Spoken like a true prolific journalist and writer, where from January to May is not fast enough to get that, is not quick to get that first feature out, which yeah, it was the longest, I think, of all of them, and it was great. Joe, on your end, did you have the foresight? Like, were you thinking about catharsis as a part of this project? Like Marty just said, like you said, yeah, hell yeah, let's write a book. After the feature came out, were you thinking this would be good for me? This would be good for the boys, and this is kind of like, I want to move through this process for that reason. Were there other reasons? Like, can you walk me through your side of what Marty was just talking about?
I mean, really, my initial intention was to, kind of set the record straight, since there was that initial, hey, these guys were eating kebabs or something like that. But, the news articles and then Marty's longer piece did that story justice. But then I also really wanted some way to document Shannon's life for my sons, because they were killed when she was so young. So I mean, we talk about Shannon every day. She's part of our daily lives. My sons at this point have heard a lot about her, but I want them to have something that they can take on their own and read and get to know Shannon and get to know us, get to know our family, but really get to know their mom. And so to me, it was just like the right thing to do is to write a book. And, emotionally, I was like, this is probably really going to suck. And there was definitely a time where I was like, I don't know if I want to do this. I could just leave the articles where they are and kind of call it good. But the way the internet moves, the internet's forever, but at the same time, like, things tend to go to the back of the internet. And so I wanted them to have something that could be a physical book that they could read on their own. And so I said, hey, let's just mentally, I had to kind of cross that bridge. Let's do it. And as I started writing it, I was like, actually, this is painful at times, very painful at times, but overall, this is pretty cathartic. But I mean, the initial mission really was for my sons. And as we really got into it too, something that Shannon always struggled with was kind of a monkey on her back, for lack of a better terms, was that she, it didn't ever feel like she had truly made it. Even though she was very, very accomplished, there really still isn't. But especially at the time, there wasn't a title that a woman could get that said that she made it. Like, she could never say, like, I'm a Ranger, I'm a Green Beret, I'm a SEAL. When I walk into a room and say I was a Green Beret in combat, people, they think I was doing amazing and heroic things. And there's a lot of gravitas that comes to that title. And, Shannon was never about chasing a title. But when she had been in this profession for so long, she did get kind of worn out of having to always explain herself and why she'd be a value added. And so she really kind of felt like she never made it. And I really I always looked at it from the perspective of, had it been me that was killed there in Manbij, what would people say? They would say, well, this guy was a Green Beret war hero. He was killed on his, upteenth deployment. Wow, what an amazing guy. Whereas Shannon, there was a lot of focus on her being a mother, which I understand that it's unique. We luckily haven't lost a lot of mothers in combat. However, there was a way for that to kind of get lost, and just for people to focus on her being like a mother. And so then it seems like maybe she just kind of got drafted and ended up getting put there. But I really wanted to tell her story, and through telling her story too, I mean, Shannon would, if she was here right now, she would punch me in the shoulder and say, hey, you need to mention everybody else, because it was never about her. She would really want the story of every other female who fought in this time frame. And there's quite a few of them, because it wasn't codified into military regulation that women could be on the front lines. But there were a lot of women in the front lines, not just in special operations, but, manning a 240 or a 50 cal on a convoy, eating IEDs with the guys, like, just because that's the way the war went down. And so she'd really want that story told. But then also those whose job it was to go out and actually hunt down bad guys, those intelligence professionals, their story really hasn't gotten told. There's a lot of books out there about guys kicking in doors and going and shooting bad guys in the face. But there's not a lot about the professionals that have to learn a foreign language, that have to learn how to intercept enemy signals, that have to sit through, endless cups of tea with tribal sheikhs to get information. Like, that story hasn't been told either. So when I put all those together, giving my sons something, but then also telling the story of a lot of the unsung heroes who we can finally, through Shannon, we can actually tell their story. Had she not gotten killed, their story still wouldn't, most of it would still be classified. We wouldn't be able to talk about it. And most of these women, there's a lot of women veterans who I hope will read Shannon's story and say, hey, I have something to add to. I want to tell my story. But I think if there wasn't a story like Shannon's out there, I think a lot of them would just say, well, no one's going to believe me anyways. Like, if, no one's going to know that I was out there on the front lines. They're not going to believe me. I'll just move on with my life. So that became the motivation behind me, writing the book.
And on that front, there's two things I want to bring up. One, there was somebody that spoke at Shannon's memorial as far as what the assumptions that people make about the profession that Shannon had. There was a guy that got up and talked and said, hey, a lot of people would assume that the cryptologists are toiling away in a windowless room somewhere far from the front line. And he said, if that were true, we wouldn't be here today. And really spoke to not just Shannon, but this community of people that are this sort of hybrid soldier, sailor, airman, Marines that are, yes, they can go be effective from a windowless room in the bottom of a ship or in a headquarters building somewhere, but they're also, many of them are out on the front line somewhere. To Joe's point about how it's only in Shannon's death that we learn more about this community of professionals and also the women among them, and how it would almost be unbelievable if you didn't have this book to really lay it out. I point to the current Sergeant Major of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. That is a woman that did come from a similar background as Shannon, but because she's still alive and because she can't talk about what her background is, I can go into any comment section on any posts about her, stories about her, where guys are like just dragging her and saying, how is she possibly in charge of all these, special forces and Rangers and Night Stalkers and everything? It's like, man, you just don't know. You just don't know what some of these people have done, and it's because she doesn't have a long tab. She doesn't have she doesn't have these things like Joe talks about, these titles that just lend instant credibility. And so hopefully this book gives people, not just for Shannon's sake, but any woman that has gone through these things, or any intelligence professional, male or female, that is like, hey, it's hard for me to talk about what I did, but read this and you'll know maybe a little bit of my experience.
Yeah. It's interesting because this reminds me a lot of Eric Blem's Fearless about Adam Brown. Can you guys hear me, by the way? I just got a notification on my, are we good? Okay. It's got a weird internet notification. It reminds me a lot of Eric Blem's Fearless about Adam Brown. That like, if Adam would have been alive and told those stories in memoir fashion, it wouldn't work as well as Blem's book did. And I think probably the same thing here. And then the other thing here that I respect deeply, Joe, specifically to you, is that like you all went in and you told a very human story about yes, a woman, a mother, a special operations professional, an intelligence professional, but then also like of a wife and a partner and a teammate with you. And you were brutally honest about some of the struggles that you had and some of the struggles that she had. And you kind of opened that up for everybody to give that additional human context, that this isn't just a black and white, like, hey, she was a badass and then she died. It's like, well, no, she was a badass and we struggled with these things and we talked about these things together and we were imperfect and we moved our way through the world to try to make the best versions of ourselves, the best family and the best professionals that we could be. So you don't have to speak to that if you don't want to, but I just want to say thank you for doing that, because I think it was a very human element to the story that makes it, yes, believable, but also just very like tangible and something that I think the story wouldn't be otherwise.
I appreciate it. I'm glad you picked up on that. I mean, it would have been easier, I think, to just talk about how badass Shannon was, and then also like, pat myself on the back for, all the stuff I did in my career. But all the stuff that we did collectively in our careers, it takes a toll on a family. And Shannon recognized that and was way more mature than I ever was up until the time that she was killed. So it was important for me to actually like tell that and to talk about it, because I know, guys I served with who had families, who their family may not have survived, because of divorce. A lot of them don't know their kids now. Like these wars took a heavy toll, not just on the battlefield, but off the battlefield too. Veteran suicide we talk about a lot too. But I mean, how many guys right now did multiple combat deployments that don't know their kids, because they don't get to see them anymore because they got a divorce? Like it's pretty heavy stuff. I mean, and I couldn't have held our family together without Shannon. But it's also just an aspect that I just don't think that we've really talked about, especially those of us that are really, really driven to always move on to, the next objective, the next deployment, the next unit you can try out for. It's a part that really falls by the wayside. And so I said to myself pretty early on, if I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to be as honest as I possibly can, even if like I'm definitely not the hero in some of the chapters.
Yeah, there's not enough that can be said about how vulnerable Joe made himself. I never had to ask him to do that either. By the way, this is something Joe did on his own, arrived at this conclusion, and the book just would not be what it is without him telling those stories and talking about those conversations and even arguments, right? Like that he and Shannon had at times. It's so much more relatable. Anybody that's ever been in a marriage can relate to some of those situations and how some of them. Joe did just as far as like the craft of writing is concerned, Joe did a beautiful job of how most married couples can relate to how a conversation starts off amicably and then kind of quickly devolves, right? Because you reach that point where both of you have reached your line in the sand, and Joe has a couple of those vignettes in there, and it wouldn't be complete, and it would look like a Wikipedia entry if we didn't have those very real emotions in there that Joe very graciously shared with the world.
Yeah, it's amazing. Good a place as any to begin to wrap things up. To end each episode, I'll ask kind of an open-ended question. But before I do that, where can folks find you and the book on social media or on the internet? What would you like me to collaborate with, and where do you want me to drive traffic for some book sales here?
I mean, the book is being sold anywhere books are sold. We're fortunate to have really wide distribution on this. So, go buy the book. I think we said that this was gonna land sometime the week of the sales. So like, it's going to be in bookstores. It's going to be available on the internet. All of that. So, and then, Joe and I are both on social media.
Amazing. Well, yeah, we'll tag and collaborate and put everything in the show notes and help to drive some sales and get this story out. Okay, so for both of you, I end each episode asking an open-ended question. What's on your heart? What's on your mind for our community right now? Could be a piece of advice. Could be something you want to reiterate from what we've already talked about here, or just something that you want to get off your chest. But Joe, we'll start with you. What's on your heart? What's on your mind?
Man, that's a big open-ended question. I think a lot of veterans struggle with finding purpose when they get out of the military. And the way our wars ended, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was Iraq, they didn't end the way that we wanted them to end. There's not a lot we can do to go back and fix that, but I do think we can move forward and try and have a positive impact on our communities. So I would just say stay engaged. Like your fight's not over because you aren't wearing your uniform anymore. There's a lot of great causes to go get behind. I think veteran suicide, veteran cancer, those types of issues are going to be essentially the whatever you want to call it, the Agent Orange. That's going to be the silent killer that keeps taking veterans of our generation. And reaching out, staying engaged, supporting each other, but really just finding a purpose and finding a mission. I think that can't be said enough. And I know there's probably a vet out there somewhere who needs to hear that. There's days where I need to hear that. So yeah, that's my message.
Yeah, same here. Thank you. Marty?
Yeah, the thing that is, as far as like what's on my mind right now, it really is the medical piece for veterans. There's some new research that has been coming out from Hunter 7 Foundation, as well as some other places, on just how much the deck is stacked against guys who spent a long time going to war, spent a long time in the military. And so at this point, it really is, I think especially guys coming out of the special operations community, there's this mentality of like, I'm not going to go to sick call no matter what, and just figure it out myself. And that extends into their post-military career a lot of times. And I just want to say, like, you cannot have that mentality anymore. You're not as young as you were. And a lot of the things that you did that you thought were completely fine are going to adversely impact you. There's studies coming out just from the simple matter of like, hey, if you spent a career in special operations, the amount of ammunition, like live rounds that you handled and shot compared to somebody that's, was in basically any other part of the military is orders of magnitude larger. And so you've got exposures that are just unique to the special operations community. And so I think, and rightly so, a lot of attention gets put on mental health, and we definitely need to be seeing somebody about those things, even if it's just maintenance, right? Even if you're not like suicidal right now or something like that, go get the maintenance done, right? PMCS your brain, PMCS your thoughts, and your mental health. But the other piece is go get checked out. Hey, if you fought in Iraq, you're probably due for a colonoscopy, right? Like that meme has been circulating a little bit. It's like, hey guys, a lot of us are in our anywhere from our early 30s to our late 40s, and it's time to go pay attention to these things. After I got out, I didn't go to a dentist for 5 years. I didn't get a primary care provider for 10 years since I was out. I mean, these are just things because it's like, I don't know what it was. I've got some theories of what it was, but like now it's to the point where like, hey, I need if not for myself, for my family's sake, I need to go start figuring out what is or isn't going on in me so that I can potentially get it taken care of. And all the way up until like, if you have the opportunity to go get a cancer screening, go get one, especially if you've got multiple deployments under your belt. Joe, reach out to Chelsea at 107. Go get your screening done if you haven't already. Okay. Like you've been there, done that. Okay. I'm going to go get one done in 2 weeks from when we recorded this. And like, we have to, if anything, guys like Joe and I and other, what I would just call people that are maybe seen as leaders in the community, we need to go set the example for everybody else of like, hey, you're not an exception. Go get checked out. Go get these things looked at. It's not fair to your kids, your family, or anybody else in your life to ignore this at this point. So that's what's been on my mind.
Yeah, well said. Obviously, your brother just wrote an article about it and put it out, and people have been sharing that around, which is great. And the first time I ever talked to Chelsea at 107, she asked what I did in the military, and I told her I loaded bombs on F-15s, and she said, "Oh, flight line, aviation, go get checked out," because just like the soft guys that are having all the ammunition, all the fluids, the JP-8, and all the crap that's going on those airframes and on that flight line day in, day out, taking naps, eating lunch, all that shit. There are pockets of our community that need different kinds and more targeted attention, but we all need attention, and it is all on us to take as much responsibility as we can for ourselves and our bodies, and like you're pointing out, for our families, so that we can have some longevity here and keep doing our work. Gentlemen, I sincerely appreciate your time, appreciate your energy, appreciate the book. As I said, I just finished it right before hopping on here. Incredible read. I will read it again, and I will share it out to friends and family, especially those that aren't in the military community, to have a better understanding of what's been happening these last 20 years. So thanks again, and best of luck on the press tour. Best of luck on sales, and we'll keep Shannon's memory alive.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, fellas.